This is American National Government, and I'm Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 1, The Basics of Political Science. Learning Objective 3, Making Sense of Politics and American Politics by Using the Scientific Method. Political science is about making sense of what goes on within politics, and it's the academic discipline dedicated to the study of politics. Now, with politics, it's interpersonal and pretty much involves everything. We tend to focus on government, political institutions, their processes, and political behavior of individuals. Now, the roots of this approach is in philosophy, law, history, and more recently, such disciplines as economics, psychology, and sociology. So we use a variety of different techniques as political scientists. But underpinning all that is the idea that it's a science. In other words, the method of acquiring knowledge that has three basic goals of describing, explaining, and predicting is the basis for political science. Now, when we learn in college and in life, we have two different approaches. Now, the first is that of normative analysis. What should we do with our knowledge? And we all have knowledge that we bring into the game. Now, this is very subjective because, as we talked about earlier, we assume that people have shared knowledge, this common sense. But common sense isn't as common as we'd like to think it is, especially because we live in a diverse society, indeed a diverse world. And what we should do with our knowledge is oftentimes easily manipulated through appeals to emotion. And this is something that, personally, I enjoy studying because emotion is the key to understanding human behavior. Now, historically, the approaches have been through philosophy, law, and history, but with the approaches of the scientific revolution, and we've got more of an approach that's an empirical approach, which is saying, what is knowledge? So what we're doing here is we're developing and using a common objective language to describe and explain the reality that we can consider around us. So the scientific research is seen in psychology, economics, anthropology, and sociology, and informs how we as political scientists go about our research. Indeed, I use ethology and animal studies to better understand humans and their behavior. So the goals of scientific research is, first of all, to be explicit. We want to define our rules and examine reality in a manner that's clearly stated. And we need to be systematic as well. In other words, each item of evidence is linked by reason or observation to other items of evidence. And it's controlled. These items are analyzed in as rigorous a manner as possible. And the greatest rigor that you can apply is that of replication. Use the three goals of explicitness, systematic approach, and controlled approaches to verify that something does exist by trying this out someplace else or at some other time. Now, there are different types of research, and they can be carried out for different reasons. Now, descriptive research, describing phenomena as they exist, is the very basis for understanding reality. And oftentimes when we think about it in popular terms, we tend to think of journalism at its best as describing just what's happening out there in the world, especially the political world. But that's not just it. It might be describing things as they exist through a systematic approach. Now, the exploratory approach is an attempt to find patterns, ideas, or hypotheses. And typically we encounter them through the columnists, the pundits, the letter writers, the bloggers. But it's something that political scientists do by figuring out what causes what. But ultimately, you have to test things out. And this is when you engage in causal explanatory research, where you understand variables by measuring relationships amongst them and seeing if they're related. In this case, we're looking at the dependent and the independent variables and testing hypotheses as to whether there is a relationship or not. And this is where the scientists really come into full force. So let's take a look at this explanatory and causal research. Here we have the dependent variable. And this is the effect of the independent variable. In other words, it's what we're trying to explain. And there are many different things that we're trying to explain, but ultimately it's a form of political behavior. Now, the independent variable, which is the presumed cause of an event, there can be many of them. So there are multiple different approaches to try to see how this independent variable affects the dependent variable. So let's take a look at different types of causal relationships. Now, a positive relationship is the idea that when you have an independent variable go up, so too does the dependent variable. So there's a causal relationship, and if one goes up, the other goes up, or if one goes down, the other goes down. A negative relationship doesn't mean that one goes down, the other one goes down. It means that if the independent variable goes up, the dependent variable goes down, or if the independent variable goes down, the dependent variable goes up. So it's inversely related. The null relationship is the assumption that there is no relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. A curvilinear relationship is just a special form of relationship in which you might have a movement in one direction for part of the data that's gathered until a certain point there's a leveling off or even a decline in this relationship. And finally, we have the idea of a spurious relationship, which occurs when the independent variable and the dependent variable, they're linked together, but when we look at it closely, it's linked together by a separate variable. Now, one of the great things about science is that we can actually represent this visually. And this is the idea of Cartesian space. So whenever we hear of the name René Descartes, who was born many centuries ago, what we're seeing here is a reference to Cartesian space, the gentleman behind it. The idea is that your y-axis is where you put your dependent variable, and your x-axis is where the independent variable is graphed. So you can represent what's going on. And this is what we're going to do over the next few slides. Now, a null relationship is where there is no relationship between the variables. And right here, I'm providing data that was collected by a mentor of mine, Jim Schubert, and myself way back during the initial decision to go into the Iraq War. And what we're looking at here is attitudes towards President George W. Bush, as well as support for different policy ideas. Here, we're looking at whether the support for George W. Bush is related to support for the United Nations overall. And what we see is that there is no relationship there. However, when we look at a relationship between support for George W. Bush and support for military action, we see there's a positive relationship. In other words, the more you support George W. Bush as president, the more likely you're going to support military action. Now, this last relationship is a negative relationship in which we see that the increased support for George W. Bush actually led to decreased support for letting the United Nations take control of the matter. So let's take a look at the theoretical frameworks that underlie these different hypotheses. And we're making assumptions about political relationships. The rational choice model of politics is the first major theory that political science deals with. And it's the assumption that there is self-interest in people and that they make choices rationally based upon the idea that they're weighing things out as far as what gives them the most satisfaction for the least cost. And the idea is that because most people are in a bell curve, with most people being moderate, that the political parties will appeal to the political center and take a moderate stance on policy issues. So what we're seeing here is probably something that we don't see in real life, especially now with our political situation. Now, what we see that's probably more accurate is the Michigan model of political behavior, which assumes that socialization leads us to psychologically attach ourselves to a political party. And the background materials such as our education, our income, and what sort of ideology our parents had, in turn leads to that party identification. In other words, people respond in predictable ways to particular environmental situations. Now, a more advanced approach to understanding this is that of the evolutionary and biological models that have taken hold within political science and throughout most of the social sciences over the past couple decades. Here, the idea is that evolutionary theories provide us a powerful set of tools to understand the behavior of many different things, from consumption to voting behavior. And the idea here is that not only does our environment play a role, but also the inheritance that we have biologically and how we respond to the environment around us. And that was Chapter 1, Section 3 of American National Government.